Hi, class. This week we're going to be focusing on Indian and Southeast Asian art. We are going to be mostly focusing on Buddhist art and Hindu art. We're going to start with Buddhist art, art and architecture, and then moving on to Hindu art and architecture. So let's get into it. The first thing I wanted to do is do a little bit of a visual activity. I have these images here that you'll see. Each of them is a depiction of Buddha, a very important, the most important figure within Buddhism. And these individual images that I have are all showing a depiction of Buddha in vastly different time periods and geographic regions. So there's going to be a wide variety of ways that Buddhism is practiced, but there's also going to be very um, core ideas in Buddhism that get repeated. And I want you to look at each of these images and look at what is similar, what you recognize between all of them. What are the things that are being repeated in each of these images of Buddha, regardless of geographic region and time period it's coming from? And then I want you to think about this idea of why do we think that this is going to be why are these particular attributes going to be the things that are repeated over and over again that are going to make Buddha identifiable as a figure? So take a second, look at these images, see what you come up with on your own, and then we're going to dig a little bit more into this. Just to give a little bit of an overview, we are going to be focusing on India and Southeast Asia. This is a very diverse area of the world where different religions are going to proliferate, lots of different languages are going to proliferate. There's lots of different types of geographies here. We're going to focus predominantly on Hinduism and Buddhism as the two dominant forms of religion and see how those manifest in art and architecture. If we talk about India from its very beginnings of the beginning of civilizations in the context of what we know India now, these south eastern regions of Asia. Um, you have this belief system that now is known as Indic, which really becomes eventually Hinduism, and then Hinduism persists, but then you have Buddhism that develops as well, and we'll talk more about specifically about both of those later. Buddhism becomes extremely popular and spreads along the Silk Road, which is very common for a lot of religions at the time of the Silk Road spread across these areas because you have these trade networks that are connecting these different regions, and you'll have influences from the West coming through the Silk Road, as well as influences from these areas towards the West, and then other parts of Eastern Asia into China, all the way into Japan, and we'll talk all about that. India itself, if you think back to a couple weeks ago when we talked about ancient Mesopotamia, kind of reminds me of ancient Mesopotamia in the sense that there's areas of India that are very prosperous and just lend themselves to civilization. There's like waterways and areas of high crop yielding. And so in those areas, if they become contentious in the sense that there are civilizations who are kind of constantly conquering each other and moving in and out of these areas as a way to be, dominant and to be able to have predictable food sources, basically, right? So these areas become very diverse, lots of different civilizations develop. And in contemporary India, there are 18 official Indian languages, which lets you know how diverse this area becomes and how much culture has developed throughout the history in this area of Southeast Asia. So geographically and ethnically quite diverse. The art that we're going to be looking at, similar to what we've seen in really a lot of the civilizations, are going to be made for wealthy patrons, made to be, anytime you see large buildings and large religious complexes, typically they are built to be a little bit bigger, to be enjoyed by more people. But we will see murals and sculptures similar to what we've seen so far in other places. A lot of the artists and the teams of artists that we're going to see are going to create works that reflect religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs, often based on canonical texts. And that's going to be specific to what religion you're looking at. So we'll get more specifically into that when we talk about Buddhism, what that looks like, and what that looks like in Hinduism as well. All right, so let's get a couple of basic ideas about Buddhism established before we get into the art and architecture of Buddhism. So, Buddhism is a major dominant religion in Southeast Asia. There are technically branches of Buddhism that practice Buddhism slightly differently, but there's still unifying principles of Buddhism and Buddhist religion that we will see predominate in a lot of these different areas. So, Buddhism really centers around this idea that life is suffering and that there is a path towards releasing yourself from suffering and achieving nirvana, and that through Buddhist practices, you can break yourself out of this. A lot of this is rooted in philosophies and worldviews that are native to India. Mostly this idea within the context of Southeast Asia. There's this principle or this idea that when you live your life, life is a cycle, that time is cyclical in the sense that you live a life, depending on the things you do in your life, constitute when you pass away, you are always reborn, and depending on what kind of life you lived, it will determine how you are reborn. So if you were a good person, you get reborn into something that is considered sort of like a better outcome in your next life. But if you didn't live a good life, then the type of life that you are born into in your next life is lesser than. Now, this idea of birth and rebirth, birth, death, rebirth, and this cycle, while there are ideas rooted in, how do I live a good life to be able to be reborn into the next life, really the heart of Buddhism is becoming completely breaking free from that cycle as being the ultimate escape, that not just reaching the highest level of rebirth, but rather breaking yourself completely out of this cycle, which is known as samsara. So if you achieve this break from this, you achieve what's known as nirvana. And so the idea is if you achieve this enlightenment, this next level, basically, that you are released from this life cycle. And when you do eventually die, your body is released and becomes just part of the universe. And you are no longer reborn, you just become dispersed in part of the grander scheme of the universe. Buddha is considered to be the first figure that pulls this off, and that's why he's this model figure. That's why Buddhism becomes established as this major religion. And we'll talk more specifically about him. So Buddha was around during the fourth, was alive, born 563 BCE, and then died 483 BCE. The story of Buddha, I'm going to show on the next slide, so we'll get a little bit more into that. But basically, he is this important spiritual figure because, again, he is the first person to achieve this enlightenment, to achieve nirvana, and people want to model the type of life he lives so that they can achieve that as well. Some of the principles of Buddhism is the middle way. So the idea of avoiding any extremes in the world. So really avoiding any sort of leaning into just worldly pleasures, and really living like an ascetic lifestyle, which means that you remove yourself from any extravagance, really living humbly. That's part of Buddhist lifestyle. There's a lot of iconography that is associated with Buddhism. And when we say iconography, there's a lot of symbols associated with Buddhism. So some of the things you'll see quite commonly are a lion. Lions are associated with Buddha and his royalty, which we'll talk about a little bit more about in a minute. The wheel. So the wheel there's two associations with it. The wheel is this idea of the life cycle as well as Buddha's law. So there's basically principles that he taught of how to live in a good way, and this is associated with the wheel. The lotus flower is very associated with Buddhism, particularly purity and adversity. Columns inside the wheel, which are associated with Buddha's teachings, as well as an empty throne, which is an idea of Buddha's ever present. So this idea that he left his throne, he achieved nirvana, but that means that he's always present because he's part of the universe. The story of Buddha is important to know too, to get a sense of like how he achieved the status he achieved. So Buddha was born as a person named Siddhartha Gautama. So he was actually a king or prince. He was born into a lavish, wealthy lifestyle as a royal. He lived his whole life protected from suffering within the palace walls. He had everything provided for him. His life was very well taken care of. But he eventually realized that this life of lavishness was not reality because he knew that he had never left his protected space. So he eventually became curious about the outside world and left, and he went on a journey. And according to the legend or the story of Buddha, he saw four things he never saw in his life in the palace, which was a sick person, a poor person, a sick person, a poor person, I'm trying to remember, I think I'm missing one. I think like a dying person basically, and then an actual dead body. Those are the figures that he saw. And when he saw those things, he realized, okay, well, I clearly don't know about the world. And he became upset about this, and he was upset about the amount of suffering in the world. So he then eventually abandoned his lifestyle in the palace. He became a monk. He eschewed all of his worldly pleasures, and he went and wanted to learn about the world and achieve spiritual enlightenment. He felt that after years of living in poverty, he still was not achieving enlightenment. He still didn't feel that he had connected to any sort of truth. So he decided to sit in front of a tree, and he wanted to meditate until he achieved answers to his questions about the world and about, why things were the way that they were. So after being under the tree for quite a long time, he believed he uh, experienced this transcendent experience where he achieved enlightenment, where he achieved nirvana, and he knew exactly what to do to be able to achieve this enlightenment. So then after doing this, he wrote down the things that he learned and then eventually created Buddhism as a religion and wanted to convey the things that he had learned to the rest of the world. So the four noble truths that Buddha developed that became really central to Buddhism as a religion are the following that I have here, which is number one, that life is suffering, that no matter what, or not no matter what, but basically the way that the world was constructed is that you are always going to be in this cycle of of birth, death, rebirth. This is suffering, that you're always going to be going through this cycle. The root cause of of suffering within this cycle is desire, that no matter what, as a human, we have desires, whether that's, worldly pleasures or really just basic desires like, food, clothing, right? Like the things that we need. And that this desire that we have must be overcome, that in order to really be enlightened, you must detach yourself from those desires. And the only way to overcome desire is through not being part of this suffering anymore, through this cycle, which is achieving nirvana, achieving a release from this cycle. So those are the four noble truths that really Buddhism is completely centered around. Buddha cosmology is really rooted in older traditions that are found in Hinduism and then go all the way back to Indic religions. But essentially, there is this view of the world, this cosmology, that there are heavens, that there are hells, and that there's spiritual planes as well as temporal planes, like where people live. And it's very complicated. We don't need to get into the specifics of it. The one major thing I just want you to know, just in terms of when we talk about architecture, will be helpful, is knowing that the center of the universe is Mount Meru. Mount Meru is the center of the universe. It is where everything extends away from. And when we look at architecture, this is going to be represented in architecture. So I just want you to know that principle. So when we move on, we'll be able to recognize it. One concept to know about Buddha and Buddhist art in particular is the idea of the Buddha canon. So the Buddha canon is something that has been established through text, but manifests itself in art. Essentially, a canon, anytime you use the word canon, is essentially this idea of like a standard. I think we talked about this with Egypt, of the Egyptian canon, this standard of how something is represented. So a Buddha canon is going to be the representation related to like the themes, the iconographies, the symbols that become associated with Buddha and Buddhist imagery. So the idea is that, you know, no matter the context, no matter the geography, no matter the time period of a depiction of Buddha, there's going to be things that are repeated in any of those contexts that will make Buddha identifiable. That's because there's actually a specific text that went through and said there were 32 attributes associated with the Buddha. So not every Buddha has those 32, but any Buddha will have some of those attributes of Buddha, making him recognizable. So anytime you see a depiction of a person, and if you're like, oh, maybe this is Buddha, there's going to be something there that you can probably point to and say, oh, well, this is how I know it's Buddha because of this. So let's look at some examples. Of what that is. So Buddha is often depicted seated in a lotus position, so in like a in a his legs crossed position. Sometimes you'll see him standing as well, but if he's in a lotus position, he'll have the balls of his feet pointed upward. That's going to be quite typical for depictions of him. Oftentimes you'll have a pose of Buddha that's compact with little negative space. Typically he's going to be frontal, symmetrical. Sometimes you'll see him with a nimbus or a halo. This is, kind of putting him in the realm of like the spiritual figure. Often you're going to see him with bodhisattvas or the basically little helper angels that surround him that are meant to help with enlightenment. Um, Most often you'll see Buddha having sort of a detached stoic expression, peaceful expression. The idea is that he's enlightened, right? He's an enlightened figure. So very rarely, at least I have never seen a depiction of Buddha where he's like in some sort of pain or something, right? Because that is antithetical to sort of the role that he serves as this peaceful figure to look up to. So I haven't seen a picture of that. I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but I have never seen a depiction like that. Often you will see him with mudras. Mudras, I have a slide on the next slide is going to give a little bit more of an example of this, but mudras are basically different hand positions that the Buddha will have, and they each communicate something. It's basically like it kind of reminds me of like sign language, of this idea of like certain positions of your hands convey a specific meaning. And a person who doesn't know sign language or a person that doesn't know a mudra will not recognize it as something specific, but a person who does know them will recognize, oh, this is supposed to convey this concept, right? And on the next slide, I'll give you a couple of examples of that. A couple of the other things that are common in a Buddha canon or a depiction of a Buddha, you'll often see him with a top knot. So you'll see this sort of top knot or this bump on his head. Most people when they see it think it's a knot or some sort of hairstyle. It's actually a cranial protuberance or a cranial bump, which is a symbol that goes farther back, like even before the Buddha figure, that is often associated with intelligent, wise people. That there's this some idea associated with this idea of this cranial bump. Often you'll see him with these elongated ears. That's a very common attribute of the Buddha figure. The reason that is so to give you an insight, if you guys have ever seen a person with gauges, like those earrings that go in that are very large, if you take the gauges out, the earlobes are quite long, right? That's because the gauges or the earrings have stretched out the earlobe. So the idea is that Buddha lived a very lavish life before he became the Buddha, right? So he would have had these lavish, large earrings that would have weighed down his ears, but the fact is that he's taken them out and has removed himself from that lifestyle. So the depiction of these large earlobes is a evidence of him rejecting that exuberant or I'm sorry, this opulent lifestyle. There's also a lack of jewelry. He's typically dressed quite humbly. Typically, he has tightly curled hair, and often he has an urna or a dot on his forehead that indicates wisdom. Sometimes he's on a predella, which is this base that sometimes has like lotus leaves attached to it or like looks like a lotus flower. So this is the idea that he is meditating, that he's this like important figure. There are specific canonized versions of Buddha as well. The two that we're going to talk about, which is why I'm mentioning it, are the Vairocana and the Sakyamuni Buddha. So the Vairocana Buddha is a reference to a universal view of Buddha. So this idea that he's this all-powerful, universal, enlightened being. So we'll kind of see some attributes of that type of Buddha. But there's also the Sakyamuni Buddha, which is a depiction of the historical Buddha. So who he was when he was alive, and this is more of like a um, more of a temporal version of him, and we'll see some examples of that. I wanted to show this slide briefly. This is the depiction of mudras that I mentioned before. So these are different hand positioning and poses that you can do that anytime you see a Buddha doing certain things with his hands, they will convey certain concepts or ideas that would not be accessible to somebody that doesn't know these mudras. But if you do know mudras, then you can read them like a language, basically. So now we're going to look at our first example of Buddhist art. We're going to look at these sculptures, which are known as the Buddhas from Bamiyan. So Bamiyan is an area in Afghanistan that is located on the Silk Road. So it gives you an idea of how far west that these ideas are traveling, because Afghanistan is westward of India. And these are some of the biggest sculptures that have existed of Buddha in these areas. So let's talk about it. So Bamiyan, like I said, is on the Silk Road. This area is considered a commercial and religious center. So this is somewhere where people would have stopped for trade, but also for religion and that these ideas proliferated. Now, these are the first colossal Buddha statues that we know about. There are other ones. And the two Buddhas that we're looking at depict the Vairocana and the Sakyamuni Buddhas, which are the universal Buddha and the historical Buddha. The bigger one is 175 feet tall. That was the Vairocana Buddha. And the one that is a little bit smaller, which is 115 feet tall, is the Sakyamuni Buddha. So the actual sculptures are sculptures that are cut rock that are carved out of a mountainside. I have this really cool picture that's going to show you exactly what it looks like from like a farther perspective. But essentially, these are these huge sculptures that there's this cliff face that they're carved out of the existing sandstone there. And then by where the feet of the Buddha are, there are these these entryways basically that have these areas out of the mountain that have been cut out that have murals and other things inside of that area to be used for worship, to be used for these religious practices. So you can actually go underneath the feet, you can circumambulate the feet, so you can walk around the Buddha, and there's even a stairway that leads to the shoulders of one of the Buddhas so people can climb to the top of it. Originally, so it would have been cut out of this sandstone, but we do know that it would have been covered in stucco. So this material that would have given it a smooth finish, because the sandstone that exists here is actually quite porous. There's all these holes that you can see it in the picture here. And I have some better pictures on the next couple of slides. So there would have been a layer of stucco as well as pigment. So it would have been painted, and also gold work and bronze potentially would have been here. So it would have been covered in all of these important materials. There also would have been halo-shaped niches around the head to give this like halo religious effect to the figures. So examinations of the Buddha have given us the evidence that there was pigment of blue, white, and red for the clothing. So I have a picture here to like sort of a reconstruction to see what the colors might have looked like on the clothing, to give a sense of, again, it would have been decorated, would have been highly visible from the roadways actually, which would have been pretty far out, but you would have seen it in the cliffside. There's all of these galleries, so not just around the feet of the Buddhas, but all along the road. There's all these galleries that would have been cut out with murals and other things that pilgrims could go and worship the Buddha essentially on this pathway. This top picture that you'll see here, you'll notice that there's these two niches that are carved out on the very left-hand side. You can see the larger Vairocana Buddha space is carved out on the left. You can see there's this, they're not right next to each other, right? Like there's quite a bit of distance between the two of them, but it allows for this opportunity for pilgrims to stop and to worship, and then you continue on and there's another. But you can see all of these holes, hundreds of galleries that are carved out for these spots for people to visit. And then these Buddhas would have been these large, very large cut stone works that you could see from quite a distance away. The Buddhas do not exist anymore. They have been destroyed. They were destroyed in 2001 by the Taliban, which are these religious, fairly extremists in the Middle East. There were sort of two reasons for the destruction. This is a perfect example of iconoclasm. We've used that term before. Historically, there have been many cultures who have participated in iconoclasm, the idea of a purposeful destruction of images for religious or political reasons, whatever the reasons are. So the reasons that these Buddhas have been destroyed were twofold. First, it was a religious expression for, so the Taliban are Muslims, extremist Muslims. So this would have been an expression of this idea that, we know that in Islam, depictions of humans is considered disrespectful. So there's a religious aspect to it. And the other expression is this was meant to be a little bit of a jab at the West because there was a lot of interest in the Buddhas of Bamiyan because of their historical and religious significance. And there was a lot of money and time and research that was spent on studying and preserving these statues, while there was a lot of problems and humanitarian aid that was asked for the people in this area that was not given. So there was this sort of frustration that there was people from the West coming and willing to spend money and time and resources on preserving these statues, but not on the people who are suffering. So this was meant to be sort of an expression of frustration over that. And there's been debate since the destruction of these statues on whether they should be reconstructed or not. It's sort of, there's reasons to do that and reasons not to do that that have been discussed. In this is these two pictures here, I think, give you a good sense of what these would have looked like originally. The image on the left is a reconstruction of what it originally might have looked like, and the image on the right is an image from 1977 before it was destroyed. But to give you a sense of the scale, this is the Sakyamuni depiction of Buddha. So this is the 115-meter one, which is the smaller of the two. So it gives you a sense of how large these were and how really amazing it was to be able to construct something like this. In 2019, there was an artist couple, a Chinese couple, Jansen Yu and Lian Huboth, who um, they proposed this artistic project to the government to ask if they could do a projected image of the Buddhas to be put into these niches to honor the memory of the statues that were here before they were destroyed, and just sort of raise awareness about these Buddha figures. So that's like kind of a cool modern project to be an interpretation of what was here before. All right, our next work is another very, very famous, important depiction of the Buddha. If you want to take a minute and look at this and see if there's any of the aspects of the Buddha canon that you see. This one's kind of hard because there's a lot of stuff around this object, so it's hard to even just see the sculpture itself, and it's highly adorned. Lots of things are going on. So it's hard to see just like the fundamental sculpture that we're looking at. But we'll get a little bit more into that. The picture on the top left is a depiction of the temple that this is located in. So you can clearly see that there's like lots of gold work, lots of handcraft, like very, very beautifully done. So clearly this is an important location, important sculpture. So let's talk about why that is. So this sculpture that we're looking at is known as the Jowo Rinpoche from the Jokhang Temple. This is a very, very important sculpture of the Buddha, and we'll talk a little bit more specifically why in just a second. So the Jokhang Temple itself is quite important because it's Tibet's oldest and most important temple. It's the first temple that was built under the King Songtsen Gampo, who united Tibet over basically he united Tibet and then essentially made Buddhism the state religion. So it's the first time that Tibet was ruled under Buddhist influence. So this is the first temple, very, very important. Jowo Rinpoche translates to Our Lord, the Precious One. This is a reference to the Buddha figure that you're seeing here. And you can't, I could not find a picture of it, but from what I read, the statue does have two mudras or two hand symbols that he's showing. One is meditation, and the other is a calling the earth to witness, which is a symbol of the moment of his enlightenment. So both of these are supposed to communicate aspects of Buddhist teachings of, what he's trying to convey. The statue itself, the reason it is considered so important is because it is believed to have the legend goes, or the story of this sculpture goes, that it was sculpted by a person named Viswakarma. Viswakarma, I can never say that word. Viswakarma. He is known as the celestial architect. The reason that Viswakarma is seen as so important is because the story goes, the belief is that he actually had a picture, an image that was created based on the historical Buddha, so Siddhartha Gautama, basically, when he was 12 years old, and that Viswakarma essentially knew what Buddha looked like in his life and then based this sculpture off of that depiction, which is there really isn't any comparison to that. There aren't other people who claim to be able to know what Buddha actually looked like in his life. So it's believed that this was potentially made on the actual image of what he looked like when he was alive. According to historians, this is something that would have been made maybe 1,000 years after Buddha was alive, so it's hard to know if that's true. There's also scholars who say that the style of the sculpture is reflective of much later styles. So there's some debate as to whether these stories are actually true, but that's the narrative that's associated, and that's one of the reasons that Buddhist worshippers are so enthralled with this sculpture. So it's believed to be from this extremely important sculptor and also to be a close resemblance to the actual Buddha. And not only that, there's also a belief that this sculpture was made to serve as a proxy for Buddha after he died, as sort of a representation of him after he passed away. So extremely important. It does we do know that the statue has been added to and refurbished many times. Clearly, you have tons of attributes that are surrounding him. Precious stones are carved into these are all things that have been rotated, but the sculpture itself, the face and the body is what has remained the same. During the 1960s Cultural Revolution in China, this was actually destroyed because during the Cultural Revolution, there was a purposeful abandonment of the past, of religious practices, all of those kind of things. So they just got rid of these things. The lower half of this sculpture was actually found in a trash heap, and then the top half was found in Beijing and was reunited in 2003 and restored. All right, now we're going to be moving on to looking at architecture that is influenced by Buddhism. Um, I the image I have here is sort of similar to what we looked at the very beginning. Each of these constructions are in very different geographic locations, but they have similarities that give you a sense of what type of stat or what type of architecture becomes kind of the standard type of architecture within Buddhism. So on the very left, you have a picture of a structure that is in India. In the middle, you have one that is located in Indonesia. On the very right-hand side, you have a structure in Cambodia, and we're going to talk about all of them. So just do a little bit of a visual analysis on your own. Look at the ground plans. Are there any similarities you see in the ground plans? Are there differences? Think about those things. And as we look at the architecture, you'll see how, what principles reflect Buddhist cosmology and the, thinking about the world, and how those conveyed in architecture. So the first structure I want to talk about, or a type of structure that is important to know about, is the stupa structure. Now, stupa actually originates before Buddhism becomes a major religion. The stupa basically means like a heap, like a pile. And a stupa has connotations to burial practices. So the idea is that you would bury somebody and then you have this pile over them, and you can also go and honor the person that was buried there. So this becomes the principal structure of Buddhism after the burial of the Buddha figure. So the shape of a stupa is this hemispherical shrine. It's this like heap again. And you often will bury people in here, but you can also bury other important things like objects that were important to them, or which basically become relics, holy objects associated with important people. And it's believed that if you build a stupa, if you build one of these structures, that actually gives you karmic benefits. So within Hinduism and Buddhism, there's this idea of karma, that you do things and the good things you do will come back to you, like in positive, like in benefits. And then if you do bad things, then bad things will come to you. So building a stupa is something that builds positive karma for you. It's believed that early stupas, there were several early stupas that were constructed, and it's believed that the remains of the Buddha were divided up and then buried in several stupas. So it's believed that some of these stupas have the actual ashes or remains of Buddha, so it becomes extremely important as like a site to worship or honor the Buddha, or have the energy of him as well. A lot of these stupas and Buddhist architecture in general takes on an important attribute, which is this idea of a walkway that allows you to circumambulate. So this idea that you have somewhere where you can go and you can walk around it in a clockwise direction towards the rising sun as like a meditative practice, as a symbol of a journey you take on this life. An attempt towards enlightenment is like a journey that you have to like work towards it and move towards it. So all of these things become part of worship for Buddhists, specifically related to the stupa structure, which gets incorporated in other Buddhist types of architecture. This hemispherical shape also is reminiscent and calls like sort of a comparison to Buddhist cosmology, which relates again to this picture that I talked about before of the Buddhist cosmology of these ideas of heaven and hell. But the center of this universe is Mount Meru. So this hemispherical shape is supposed to be a reference to this mountain, the center of the universe where everything extends out from. There's also typically a central like umbrella spire sort of on the top of a stupa. These are meant to symbolize the three jewels of Buddhism, which is the Buddha, the figure himself, his law, and the community of monks, that this is representative of those three aspects. There's also a symbol of the axis mundi, or the unmoving center, which is Mount Meru again. And this unmoving, this circle too is reminiscent of this idea of the wheel of life, but also moving towards enlightenment. And there's also oftentimes Toranas at these locations with stupas, which are basically gates that face in the four cardinal directions. So they're like the entryways into this area of the stupa, but also are meant oftentimes tell narratives related to the Buddha's life, specifically his birth, enlightenment, first sermon, and nirvana. This stupa that we're going to look at is one of the earliest stupas that we know about, and we're going to look at some specifics as to why exactly it's so important. So this is known as the Great Stupa. This is in Sanchi, India. There were many stupas that were built by King Ashoka. He was the first king to convert to Buddhism and to start trends of Buddhist stupas. And so this is one of the ones that he constructed. And this is considered like the largest and most important one. There's a trapezoidal stairway, again, this idea of circumambulating that you can go. It's on the south side that leads to an upper walkway. And there's also the four Toranas, which tell the stories of Buddha's life, like I mentioned as well. Um, there's several symbols that become synonymous with Buddha, the empty seat, footprints, horses. But we don't actually see a human form of Buddha represented. We just have like associations with parts of his life. There's also yakshis, which have connections to the local area here. So it's not just Buddhism that's being represented, but it's local lore specifically related to fertility. And there's also inscriptions that have names of over 600 individuals that contributed to the construction of this. Again, there's this idea that if you help construct a stupa, that you have good karma. So you want to like take credit, right? You want to sort of associate yourself with the construction of it. Yeah, so a lot of the donors that contributed were just regular common people, monks, people who were just trying to build good karma for themselves. And then the stonework that we see would have originally been painted white, but that has deteriorated since then. Here's another depiction of the Tiranas close up, just to give you a sense of what these things look like. All right, our next structure we're looking at is going to build on this vocabulary that we're developing of Buddhist architecture, the stupa structure. This is a structure that is located in Indonesia. This is a structure that will have a lot of the features that we saw from the Great Stupa, but on a much larger scale. So this is known as Borobudur. This is the largest Buddhist architectural structure in the whole world. Again, this is in Indonesia. It's considered a pilgrimage site, a place that worshipers will go and consider as like a form of worship just to even be in this place. It's a pyramidal monument, so you have sort of like a version of a step pyramid that, which we've seen examples of that so far. The entire thing has 9 tiers. There are 6 square tiers on the bottom, and then 3 circular tiers at the very top that culminate in a big stupa or mound or heap on the very top, but the entire thing is supposed to be reminiscent of this idea of a stupa. And there's actually a lot of smaller stupas on here as well, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So the entire monument is meant to be symbolic of Buddhist cosmology, specifically this idea of traveling between the different levels of life or of the universe. So there's the lower levels, which is the world of desire, of temptation. The middle floors represent the corporeal world or the world of forms, and the top is supposed to be associated with this idea of the spiritual world, which is free from desire and attachment. One of the things that is really cool and important to know, and we talked about it before with the Great Stupa, is this idea of circumambulation, right? You walk around this thing and you walk, and you're supposed to walk up this entire structure to the very top. You'll even notice in this image I have on the top, there's on the lowest floor where you have the grass, there's actually a path that has been sketched out because people have been walking around this for such a long time. So you'll notice that there's this path that has been etched out through walking that goes and continues all the way to the top of this form. So the idea is that as you're walking through and you're moving from the world of desire and temptation to the corporeal world to the world of freeing yourself from desire and attachment, is similar to a spiritual journey. It's like you're physically walking what you want your spiritual journey to be. You want to go from the world of desire and temptation, moving through the corporeal world to eventually get yourself to freeing yourself through enlightenment. So you're basically going through this miniature version of the universe on this smaller scale through navigating this architecture. The structure itself has over 500 smaller stupa, and they look like these little bells. You'll notice here in the bottom picture, you have all these depictions of bells. And inside of those, sorry, I said 500. It's 1,500 stupas with 500 life-size depictions of Buddha within some of them. So there's lots of Buddhist statues, and many of them are actually inside of these bells. So if you ever physically go to this place, you can like look into the little holes that are these diamond shapes in the stupas, and you'll look inside, and there's a Buddha inside of them, which is reminiscent of this idea that the stupas represent the body of Buddha because he was buried in a stupa. And his, energy is there basically. So as you're navigating this space, you can look to these stupas and reference and constantly be thinking about Buddha as being this like person to achieve, to move towards. In the depictions of the Buddha, he's typically cross-legged with a preaching mudra or hand symbol. And again, we have this idea that the Buddha is inside many of these stupas, which allude to the idea of what a stupa is, which is this sepulcher function, this reliquary, this place, this burial of the Buddha. And many of these stupas are relatively small, but again, it's because you're constantly thinking, you're constantly referencing him on your journey inside of the structure. And the bottom of the Borobudur structure is in this sort of like square shape, and each of the sides of the square point in the four cardinal directions, so north, south, east, and west, to again give this sense of this cosmology of the world. The structure itself of Borobudur is also meant to reference Mount Meru, which we've talked about as being the center of the universe, the axis mundi. And the entirety of sorry, there's a fly. The entirety of Borobudur is also covered in these relief sculptures as well that tell different narratives related to the Buddha's life. This is an example of one that, just to give you a sense of what some of them might be. This one specifically is Queen Maya riding a horse carriage retreating to Lumbini to give birth to Prince Siddhartha Gautama. So this is a depiction of Maya, Queen Maya, who is the mother of Siddhartha Gautama. Siddhartha Gautama is the person that eventually becomes the Buddha. So this is a depiction of him before he's born. Again, this important moment, right, of him being brought into the world, which is extremely important in the sense of thinking about the cosmology and the, construction of the universe and things like that. So the whole scene you can see is densely packed with figures, horror vacui, fear of empty space. You have the queen reclining on the carriage. Oh my gosh, come on. I don't know why this isn't turning on. There we go. So you see her being carted in this grand procession, and she's on her way to give birth to the historical Buddha. Here's some more images just to give you a sense of what these Buddha figures look like in the niches, as well as some of the stupa, the mini stupas that there would be Buddha figures in as well. Here's a depiction of sort of the front end of Borobudur, and you can see how people are navigating the staircases. And one of the things I wanted to give you an idea about as well is one of the things closely associated with Buddhism is the idea of meditation, right? Meditation often constitutes this idea of something that brings calm and peace, clearing of your mind. And when you do this circumambulation, when you do this walking around the structure and you're navigating, you're going up these tiers, there's this idea that the entire experience can be meditative in some way. You know, some people think about like hiking as being meditative. You're doing some sort of activity in a repetitive way that you're not really trying to do something extravagant. I don't know how, it's hard to describe, but it's this idea that you're doing something over and over again to clear your mind and to detach yourself from the world, from your, kind of typical concerns. So this walking is part of this meditative activity that brings on the state that really led Buddha to enlightenment. So you're going through this meditative process, moving towards enlightenment as you're doing it. One of the other things that's interesting is there's lots of text that's carved into some of the sculpture or into the relief sculptures as well. And I put some of the text that is on the walls, and a lot of it really has associations with this idea of a journey or a path. So I have some of these things here. So I will lead those who have lost their way to the right road, right? So road is this, going on a journey, going on a path. I vow to shut the door to evil destinies and open the right paths of humans. This path is traveled by illumination, the path of safety, false paths. Buddha shows them the right path. So a ton of the text really speaks to the function of this architectural space, which is to encourage you to physically travel this road, to physically travel this path, this meditative path, which is symbolic of this spiritual path towards enlightenment. And then I have this really great video that gives a lot of great imagery and insight into Borobudur that I'm going to add here.
Buddhist cosmology, the Borobudur temple compound. The island of Java, Indonesia, Mount Merapi, meaning red fire, is an active volcano. The temple complex was rediscovered by the British in 1814. It is known as Borobudur among the local people. The base is a 1,200 square meter terrace topped with 6 tiers. The walls are adorned with numerous Buddha reliefs. The total length of the galleries when placed end to end stretches for 5 kilometers. Borobudur was probably built between the 8th and 9th centuries. The exact purpose of its construction is not clear. One theory is that the complex represents Buddhist cosmology. It's a mandala. A group of reliefs hidden at the back of lined stones at the base were discovered in 1885. It was a significant discovery. The words ugly face are inscribed in ancient Javanese script. It describes the earthly world dominated by greed. The monument represents the 3 worlds of Buddhist cosmology. The base level is the world of desire. The world of forms is above. Then comes the world of formlessness, the highest level of enlightenment. As visitors walk across the gallery, they enter the world of forms. They can see images of people trying to achieve mastery over worldly desires. The daughters of the author of evil, opposed to Buddha, are trying to seduce him. He absorbs himself in meditation, convinced they are illusions of his own mind. As visitors progress and reach the top level, the gate to the world of formlessness awaits. Stupas appear amid the world of formlessness. 72 are neatly lined. Statues of Buddha are hidden inside. They can be glimpsed through the grate. There is a 10-meter-high stupa at the top of the monument. Standing right at the center of Borobudur, it encourages Buddhists the world over to strive for enlightenment with diligence.